Hello, and welcome back to The World is Storytelling with me, Ronnie. And this time, with the amazing Ben. Now, before we get onto this week's episode, or this episode, today is a year to the day of the first episode of this podcast coming out. Now, that first episode was with the amazing Dr. Julie, and it was about a minute long. To think that this would be now the 62nd episode, and that this podcast would have taken me around Europe, that I would have hiked the Camino, that I would have spoken to people along the way, that I would have met fantastic people through this podcast and heard more of their stories is just mind-blowing. And I want to thank every single one of you listeners. We are upwards of 5,000 listens. There's over 200 subscribers on Spotify alone. And irrelevant of the numbers, I'm just so grateful that there are those of you that do listen and that are interested in the stories of others. So keep listening. We are not stopping here. There's so much more left to come. So thank you for listening during this past year. So yeah, let's raise a glass to the world is storytelling, to hearing others' stories, to sharing our own, and to making the world a better place through stories. Now, before we get onto this episode with the amazing Ben, why are ghosts absolutely terrible at telling lies? That's right, because you can see right through them. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. So tell a story, one that is true. Yeah. So welcome back to The World is Storytelling, and welcome to The World is Storytelling, Ben. Now, the start of this podcast is going to be quite meta, because as I was explaining to you, Ben, before the reasoning and the ideology and the theory behind this podcast, that we usually go through stories, and I gave the example of someone who was vegan and would be perhaps better received by sharing stories about themselves being vegan rather than sharing an hour of scientific research and facts to try and make other people vegan. But however, you then said to me, oh no, well, I actually became vegan perhaps because you heard a fact. So tell us that story.
Yeah, well, hi, Ronnie. Thanks for having me. That's exactly true. Just to give you some context, I have a sister who's been vegetarian since she was 9 and been vegan for the last 20 years. 2 vegan nephews, a vegan brother, sister-in-law. So I've been very exposed to that mindset, and was relatively, like most carnivores, resistant to it. Whenever when you talk about it, a certain filter would go through my ears. By accident, I ended up watching this 4-minute video by a lady called Melanie Joy, explaining how she got to being vegan. But there was just one aspect of it, all of a sudden, that tweaked and had this deep emotional response, as she explained that actually, when you are going to react, when you put your fork into a piece of meat, and the fact that it's pork as opposed to being, a puppy dog, you have these very different emotional reactions. They're not yours. They are instilled into you by this kind of brainwashing that's going on. And I had this deep reaction that said, but I want to control my life. I want to decide if I want to eat meat or not. I don't want somebody else to make my mind up for me. And that really twigged, and it was a really powerful emotion, and hopefully it's a little bit of a story that it was one of those epiphany moments.
Yeah, talking about powerful stories and images, because you mentioned to me before this recording that aside from the cool sustainability work that you do, you also are a Baroque flute artist. Did you say? Musician?
Yeah, I'm passionate about it. I wouldn't. I'm not a professional musician. I'm just the level below. I do play concerts, and I occasionally have solo parts and things. Ever since I was a child, really, I've responded to art, particularly when it's very constrained. I find that if you give somebody freedom to do what they want, to throw paint all over the wall or whatever, yeah, that's nice. I don't disrespect it. But I personally react more when the artist can only express their unique talents within very constrained and strict rules. When you listen to one piece of music by Johann Sebastian Bach and another piece, they sound completely different, yet they respect this very, very strict rule set. So when I pick up my flute and I'm doing well, and I manage to sometimes create something that's so subtle. When you're playing Baroque music, you have these strict rules, for example, with how you can do ornaments, and you have all these very strict rules, and yet you can have fun and create stuff. I find that always energizes me, how you can get new novelty out of doing the same thing over and over again, and just finding a very subtle modification from one time to the other. So that's where I am with my journey with Baroque flute at the moment.
Yeah. I currently have my eyes closed, and I'm doing that because the way you describe these very strict rules for making music, but also the product of the music, which is then a powerful creation which feels very free. And I wonder if you've ever felt that moment where you've been so rooted in rules and grounded in what you're doing, but that has led you to be able to just fly freely with this music.
Last summer, I had this amazing luck. One of my flute teachers from many years ago was giving a course in Switzerland that was destined for young prodigies. And it turned out the course didn't have quite enough flautists there, so all the teachers were asked to try and bring some more students. And so, I'm going to be 60 this year, so I'm very far from a young prodigy. Yes, I wrote to the organizer and said, look, this is who I am. This is my musical journey. And my friend Luis has told me that you might have a space for me. And they invited me in. So I had this amazing course, and the other musicians there ranged from 12 to 18.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yes. And they were all like 2 or 3 orders of magnitude better than me technically. What they wanted to do for these future professional musicians is to expose them to all different aspects of the music trade, not just playing their flute. And one of them was improv. And so we had this amazing teacher, and I had 2 hours with her. And it was probably it was the most powerful musical experience I've had in my life. I've never been much for improvising. Like many people, I can sing in my bath when nobody can hear, and I can improvise a little bit when I'm all on my own playing, but to improvise in front of someone, that was something I'd never been able to achieve. And so she spent an hour with me. So she first said, pick up your flute, and she'd play something. She was a violinist, and she'd ask me to play back, and I just couldn't. It was just beyond me. And so we sat down, and she gave me a poem to read, and she put some music on and said, read the music in, however it feels right. And we did that for like 15, 20 minutes. Then we did it walking. And then I'm not a dancer, but she got us to sort of dance a bit to the music. And then I picked up my flute again. So this whole process took an hour. And towards the end, she then picked up her violin, as she'd done in the beginning, and played me something that was corresponded to the music we were listening to. And I just didn't know where it came from, but I answered her. And it was almost like as powerful as, sexual experience. It lasted like 3 or 4 minutes, I'd say, our musical dialogue, but that's never happened to me before. And, I'd been a musician for like 40 years.
But before we finish off, Ben, I'd love to ask you, something that seems to come up quite often is that people have this humorous anecdote which they keep for dinner parties or sitting down with someone new, their classic icebreaker story. Perhaps it's something that they have a little silly about themselves once. And sometimes for some people it changes every week. Do you have something like that? A story that you want to share with us? Yeah.
I suppose I have. I have to tread carefully here because there's some privacy issues. But my father died about 5 years ago and was a journalist. And I learnt on his deathbed that he also had another career, a more secretive career. And without going into any details, it shed some light on experiences of my youth, which I never really understood. And all of a sudden I understood them. Like when I was 12 or 13, we had this slightly decrepit mansion house in France we were living in. And the weekends we'd always have guests there. And I never knew why at the time, but they'd usually be Russian or Chinese diplomats. One experience was we had this toilet where the door handle would occasionally fall off on the wrong side. And if you were in the toilet, you'd have to knock or shout and get somebody to open the door for you, or you'd be stuck in the toilet.
Yeah.
And this was a very old house, and the toilet was very big, and it had one very, very high window. And we had a Russian diplomat staying for the weekend. And I was walking down the corridor and I saw the door handle had fallen off. I said, "Oh, somebody's stuck in the toilet. So let me let them out." So I knock politely on the door. No answer. That's a bit strange. So I put the handle back together, open the door. And inside the toilet, I see this completely white-faced, obviously very scared man trying to climb out of this very difficult to get to window that was, if he'd succeeded, he'd probably have died, because it was like a 5-meter drop on the other side. And when he saw me, he was surprised, and then all of a sudden I saw him relax and smile and climb down from his attempt and go out and carry on with his day. And I never quite understood that reaction until I thought, well, damn it, he must have been a spy too. And he must have thought he was caught in some strange counter-espionage or whatever system, and was trying to flee for his life. And he was just unfortunate door handle falling off a door by accident. So there's my little anecdote for you.
That is a great anecdote, and we aren't going to get bugged by anyone, will we? For sort of talking about this out loud?
Well, this incident would have happened almost 50 years ago.
So we're probably safe, you say?
Yeah.
Well, on that note, thank you very, very much for coming on The World is Storytelling, Ben.
You're welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, I thank you.
Some say the old ruins in the sand tell us every story will come to an end. But my dear, we can live what we tell. We are storytelling anymore.